please just give us an introduction to yourself and the background?
So I'm Marc Tarpenning. I'm the co-founder of Tesla Motors. And then before that, I also co-founded Nuvo Media, which was a digital media book company, much like the Kindle is now.
Now, just kind of focusing in on your Tesla experience, obviously it's an electric vehicle. Why did you choose that over other propulsion methods?
So in 2003, when Martin Eberhard and I started Tesla, we really looked carefully at what kind of fuel would be the right thing for a car, because our goal was to reduce oil consumption. We were trying to find a propulsion system that reduced specifically oil. When we looked at that, we thought, well, hydrogen fuel cells, they were a very popular thing at the time. And when we did the analysis, hydrogen is not a primary fuel. It is only an energy carrier. You have to make hydrogen. Hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, but it's out there in the universe, not on this planet. There are no hydrogen mines. So you have to make it, and by the time you add the energy into making it and transporting it and compressing it and then converting it back into electricity for a hydrogen car, you lose, theoretically, assuming you actually can get it as good as the theory predicts, you're going to lose 70 or 80% of all of the energy. Whereas if you simply recharge lithium-ion batteries, charge them up and then discharge them into a car, both of those processes are over 90% efficient. So, there isn't going to be another doubling of efficiency of electric cars because they're already in the very high 80s, just off the shelf. You don't have to invent anything. And we looked at biomass and ethanol and all of those other ones, and again, it kept coming back that if you just simply take the source fuel and burn it in an existing generator with no fancy enzymatic processes that you'd have to invent to make those fuels functional, you still can drive further on an electric car than you can with any conceivable combination of enzymes and fancy processes and getting back to internal combustion engine cars.
Now, obviously there's been a lot of talk about electric vehicles and their major drawback, which is the range of them with the batteries. Now, do you feel for electric vehicles to be, taking over from the standard internal combustion, it really relies on the company supplying the infrastructure like, Better Place or something like that, or is it up to the car manufacturers themselves?
Well, a couple of things. First off, when we started Tesla, obviously there was no Project Better Place or other companies that are thinking of putting recharging stations anywhere. So we decided to address that by simply building a very large battery pack and coming into a piece of the market that could afford it. Mm-hmm. So it's expensive to get a 250-mile range, but that largely relieves this, range anxiety that people talk about. Because most people here only drive, 40 or 50 miles in a day, and 200, 240 miles, that's a really long drive. The other thing is that, at least in this country, most households have more than one car. And if you actually ask people, a common question we would get, what if you wanted to take your electric car on a long drive, cross-country drive or whatever? We would be asked that, and I would always say, well, how many cars do you have? And my wife has this car and I have this other car. When you go on a long drive, which car do you take? And they would always have an answer. So it might not be the answers would be for different reasons, but maybe because one gets very good fuel economy, maybe because it's more comfortable or whatever. But they'd always have an answer, which meant to us that you could replace half of the cars, at least in the United States, with electric cars, and the only behavior change for people would be that those people, the spouse that had the electric car, would simply never have to go to a gas station again. So we thought that was a way of getting around this sort of chicken and egg with the infrastructure problem. You didn't need to have recharging stations everywhere because, in fact, if you have enough range for your daily driving, and if you try to go very far, you always take the other car anyway. Yeah. Now, that wouldn't be applicable in every place on the planet, but certainly in the United States that's the case. In terms of, if the more of those charging stations that you have, that allows you to actually make smaller battery packs viable, because then people don't have that anxiety about running out of power, which then brings the price down, which then increases the adoption. So it's all goodness if you have those things. But at Tesla, at least, we decided not to depend on that. We couldn't, because it didn't exist.
Obviously, Tesla's had some amazing traction already, but do you feel most of the people buying the cars, is it for their performance, which is amazing? Is it for the fact that they are an electric vehicle, or is it purely because they're almost seen as a fashion accessory? They're a brand that people look up to.
Well, yes. Yeah,
all three.
All of those things. most of the people who buy Teslas are people who are, they have some kind of green bent, whether it's wanting to reduce CO2 emissions or just in general getting off of oil. We also have a whole group in this country that are interested in national security because, we import a lot of oil in the United States. And that is clearly not in our national interest from a economic standpoint or a security standpoint. So we also have quite a few customers that want to do something to get off of oil, and it's kind of nice to be able to feel morally superior while blasting past that Prius, at 100 miles an hour. So, that is good. We also do have a cadre of people who really couldn't care less what the propulsion system was. Electric cars are inherently higher performance, and there are people who are very focused on that performance aspect. And they love the fact that it's electric because it's sort of interesting, but they really like going from 0 to 60 in sub 4 seconds. And they like that instantaneous torque, even at high speeds. And so there's quite a few customers like that as well. You want your product to sort of appeal to a broad swath of the public, and that's what we did.
Now, going in the other methods of propulsion, how do you think this industry is going to change over the next decade? Obviously, a lot of advancement has already occurred. Where do you think it will go from here?
I think that batteries will continue to get better, and we're already seeing that. This period right now, we're seeing the first announcements from the cell manufacturers, the people who actually make the batteries, for cells that are really targeted at the auto industry. That's never happened before. They're always targeted at camcorders and laptops, which have different characteristics and different needs. So you see, Panasonic's recent announcement of 3.1, 3.4, and 4 milliamp hour cell, and 4.0 amp hour cells. Very, very beefy energy, very high energy density, very impressive cells, specifically targeted at the automotive industry. So the battery manufacturers are responding to the potential of a giant new market. That's going to drive down costs. It's going to make the battery packs lighter and have much better charging characteristics. That's going to change what kinds of compelling cars you can make. So that's all a virtuous cycle, and that's all good. However, that all said, internal combustion engines will still dominate for a really long time.
Yeah.
We got here over the course of 100 years, and it's going to take many, many decades for electric cars to make very serious inroads into the production of cars. There'll certainly be areas where they're very popular, but for the world market, it's going to take decades and decades and decades for electric technology to really become even 50%. I think it's going to, in 30 years, it's going to be hard.
Now, getting to that stage, do you feel it's up to governments and private companies, or do you think it's purely up to the companies themselves to make this happen?
Well, I think that there's a role in both. One thing is that governments should correctly tax the fuel source, so that at least in the United States particularly, we've got tax incentives that make petroleum-based products cheaper than they are everywhere else. And that, I think, doesn't correctly account for the external costs of the oil industry. Mm-hmm. So government has a role, I think, to level the playing field in that case. Also, remember, it is okay for governments to say, because of other national interests, we believe we shouldn't be importing as much oil, or we should be reducing CO2 emissions, and therefore put incentives that do that. And those things tend to favor electric cars. Mm-hmm. I think any government policy should be technology neutral. It should be goal oriented. Mm-hmm. We're going to reduce CO2 emissions, or we're going to reduce oil consumption. How you get there is up to the private sector, mm-hmm. and we'll figure it out.
Okay. Now, obviously, you've been on both sides of this. You've been the entrepreneur starting Tesla, founder of Tesla, but you're on the investor side as well with Mayfield. From your experience, why do most entrepreneurs, that do fail, why do they fail in this clean tech sector?
Well, there's two things. First off, I was what's called an entrepreneur in residence at Mayfield. So right away, Mayfield is saying that, well, he's not actually really knows what he's doing in terms of spending our money, but we're going to rely on him for some advice. I think there's a couple of things. One is that the venture capital community as a whole wasn't very sure about clean tech in terms of how to invest in it. What would make sense. The VCs have particular timelines for different kinds of investment. Tech investments tend to be very short. Biomedical, for instance, tends to be very long because of the approval processes and the tests you have to do. And nobody really knew with clean tech as to whether it was going to be a short cycle or a long cycle. And it's looking like it's going to be much more of a long cycle. So and it's going to be much more capital intensive than a lot of the VCs are used to. So if your investors are expecting a very short turnaround with not very much capital, I think that is going to lead itself into failure, except in certain niche companies, because clean tech tends to be more capital intensive and longer term play. Also, companies fail for all the regular reasons that companies fail. Bad market timing. The product doesn't work very well. The management team is not performing. Those are all standard things, and that affects clean tech just like everybody else.
Now, if you had to give some advice to entrepreneurs wanting to get into this clean tech space, what would it be?
Well, don't wait until the technology is easy. You should always, if it's a technology play in clean tech, you want to do it when the technology is actually still fairly hard and you can just barely do it. Because once the technology is easy, it will have been done. It will have been done by 3 or 4 companies, and there will be no more room to play. If you're an entrepreneur, please also be realistic. The markets are not that great for a lot of things. You can't have a business model that depends on giant government subsidies, because those are very ephemeral and change with every time the election cycle comes around. And it's not a real business unless it makes money, standing on its own. It's hard to raise money. It's hard to raise money for any venture. And clean tech at the moment, I think, gets more attention than many of the other things that you might want to raise money for. So in that way, it's good. But just remember that raising money is the hardest thing that you can do, because there's many, many good ideas, many good teams out there, and there's only so much investment capital around.
Marc, thank you very much.
Thank you.